The woman sits across from Father Michel in the small stone room behind the chapel, hands folded in her lap, eyes downcast. She has been volunteering at this Beirut parish for 11 months now. She assists with food distribution, teaches English to children twice a week, and occasionally helps with administrative tasks. The priest trusts her. The congregation knows her face. She is invisible in the way only the genuinely helpful can be. What Father Michel does not know is that the woman across from him is not Lebanese. She is Israeli, and the man she is about to ask him about is not a fellow volunteer. He is a Hezbollah intelligence officer using this church as a cover to coordinate arms shipments from Iran. She has 15 seconds to make this work. If the priest hesitates, if he asks the wrong question, if his voice carries through the thin door behind her, the operation collapses. The target will vanish. The intelligence will go dark, and she will be trapped in a city where Israeli operatives do not get trials. Her hands do not shake. Her voice is calm, apologetic, as she leans forward slightly and says the phrase she has rehearsed 1,000 times in Hebrew, then Arabic, then English, calibrating every syllable for tone, for sincerity, for just enough vulnerability to feel real. Outside, 2 Mossad backup units are positioned within 3 blocks. One is ready to extract her if this goes wrong. The other is ready to eliminate the target if the priest confirms what Tel Aviv already suspects. But neither can help her in this room. For the next 60 seconds, she is alone with a man who could either give her the confirmation that breaks open a weapons network, or who could say one word too loudly and end her life. How did an Israeli agent end up trapped here, betting everything on one impossible conversation with a man who has no idea he is part of a covert war? To understand how Mossad placed an operative inside a Beirut church, you have to understand what Hezbollah had become by the early 2010s. This was no longer a militia hiding in southern Lebanon. It was a parallel state with its own intelligence apparatus, its own foreign networks, and its own doctrine of strategic patience. After the 2006 war with Israel, Hezbollah rebuilt faster than anyone expected. But it did not just rebuild its military capabilities, it rebuilt its intelligence infrastructure. And one of the lessons it learned from that war was that Israel's greatest advantage was not firepower, it was information. Mossad had penetrated Hezbollah's communications. It had mapped its command structure. It had turned people inside the organization. So Hezbollah adapted. It stopped using cell phones for sensitive communication. It moved weapons through civilian infrastructure, and it began embedding operatives in places Israel would never think to look. Hospitals, universities, aid organizations, churches. The logic was simple. Western intelligence agencies and the Israeli Mossad were always scanning for the usual markers of militant activity: mosques with radical preachers, known smuggling routes, suspicious financial transfers. But a Catholic charity distributing food in Beirut, a parish hosting interfaith dialogue events, that kind of operation stayed off the radar, and that is exactly what Hezbollah did. In 2012, Israeli intelligence began noticing a pattern. Several known Hezbollah logistics officers had connections to religious institutions that served mixed communities in Beirut. Not Shia mosques, not Hezbollah strongholds in the Dahieh, but churches and NGOs operating in neutral or Christian-majority neighborhoods. One name kept appearing in intercepts. A man we will call Fadi. Mid-30s, fluent in French and Arabic, no combat history, no public ties to Hezbollah. But his financial records told a different story. Small, irregular payments from accounts linked to IRGC front companies, travel logs that aligned with the known weapons shipment, timelines, and phone metadata that placed him in proximity to senior Hezbollah operatives during key planning windows. Fadi volunteered at a church in East Beirut. He helped organize charity drives. He spoke at interfaith events. And according to Mossad's assessment, he was coordinating logistical support for Iranian arms transfers into Lebanon, using the church's administrative cover to move money, arrange meetings, and shelter operatives in transit. But suspicion is not proof, and Mossad needed proof. Not just to justify action, but to understand the full scope of the network. If Fadi was one node, how many others were there? What routes were they using? Who else in the church knew? And most critically, could this network be dismantled without triggering a wider confrontation? That is when the decision was made. Mossad would not strike from outside. It would send someone in. The woman who walked into that Beirut church 11 months before the confession room meeting was not using her real name. Her legend, the fabricated identity that intelligence agencies build for deep cover operatives, had taken 9 months to construct. She was given a French passport under a false identity. Her cover story was simple and verifiable. She was a graduate student researching interfaith dialogue in post-Civil War Lebanon. She had academic credentials from a real university. She had published a paper under her cover name. She had a social media presence that went back 3 years. If anyone dug into her background, they would find a consistent, boring trail of someone genuinely interested in religion and reconciliation. The training was different from typical Mossad fieldwork. She was not preparing for a raid or an assassination. She was preparing to be uninteresting, to blend in so thoroughly that even trained counterintelligence officers would see nothing worth investigating. She studied Catholic rituals, learned the rhythms of parish life, memorized the social dynamics of Lebanese Christian communities. She practiced small talk. She practiced patience. The insertion was slow. She arrived in Beirut in early 2013, rented a modest apartment in a neutral neighborhood, and spent the first 2 months doing exactly what her cover identity said she was doing. She attended academic conferences. She interviewed local religious leaders. She published blog posts about her research. She was visible but not memorable. Then she approached the church, not as a spy, as a volunteer. She attended a few services. She spoke with Father Michel after Mass one Sunday, mentioned her research, asked if the parish ever needed help with its community programs. He said yes. She started small, helping with food distribution once a week, assisting with English classes, building trust the way real trust is built, through consistency, through reliability, through months of showing up. Mossad did not rush her. The operation had no hard deadline. The priority was access, not speed, and after 4 months, that access came. Father Michel asked if she could help with administrative work, scheduling, correspondence, organizing events. She said yes, and that is when she began to see the patterns. Fadi was careful, but he was not invisible. He attended certain meetings that had no clear agenda. He received visitors who did not fit the usual profile of church volunteers. And on 3 occasions, the woman observed him stepping away to make phone calls, always in Arabic, always brief, always with a level of operational discipline that did not match his cover as a casual volunteer. She reported everything back to Tel Aviv through a secure protocol that involved no direct communication. Dead drops, encoded messages hidden in academic emails. A Mossad case officer in Cyprus who coordinated her reports and fed them into the broader intelligence picture. And slowly, the picture became clear. Fadi was not just using the church as a meeting point. He was using it as a logistical node. Money moved through the church's charity accounts. Messages were passed during events. The church's neutrality, its respectability, made it the perfect cover. But Mossad still needed direct confirmation. They needed someone inside the church, someone Fadi trusted, to verify his role. And that is where the woman's 11 months of patience became the foundation for one final, high-risk move. She needed to get Father Michel to confirm what Fadi was really doing. And she needed to do it in a way that did not expose her, did not alert Fadi, and gave Mossad the final piece of intelligence it needed to act. By month 10, the woman had become part of the church's inner circle. She knew the rhythms of the parish. She knew which volunteers were genuinely devout and which ones, like Fadi, treated their involvement as something more transactional. She knew Father Michel's schedule, his habits, his blind spots. But knowing is not the same as proving, and Mossad's operational requirements were clear. They needed verifiable confirmation that Fadi was coordinating Hezbollah activity through the church. That meant either catching him in the act or getting someone who had direct knowledge to confirm it. The first option was nearly impossible. Fadi was too disciplined. The second option meant turning Father Michel into an unwitting intelligence source. The risk was enormous. If the priest suspected what she was really doing, if he mentioned the conversation to anyone, if Fadi picked up even a hint that someone was asking questions, the entire operation would collapse. Worse, it would expose Mossad's ability to place operatives inside civilian institutions in Beirut, a capability they had spent years developing and could not afford to burn. But there was a narrow opening. Father Michel had begun to express quiet concerns about Fadi. Nothing overt, just small comments. Questions about why certain visitors only came when Fadi was present. A passing remark about how some of the financial paperwork seemed inconsistent. The priest was not suspicious in the intelligence sense, but he was observant in the pastoral sense. And that was enough. The woman began to test the boundaries. She asked careful, indirect questions about church finances. She mentioned casually that some of the donation records seemed to have gaps. She never accused anyone. She simply raised the kind of administrative concerns that a diligent volunteer might notice. Father Michael trusted her, and slowly he began to share more. Not because he thought anything sinister was happening, but because he valued her input. He mentioned that Fadi had introduced several donors over the past year. He noted that some of the charity distributions seemed to be coordinated outside the usual church channels. He even expressed mild frustration that Fadi sometimes made decisions without consulting him. None of this was proof, but it was confirmation of a pattern, and it gave the woman the opening she needed. She waited for the right moment. A day when Fadi was out of the city. A time when Father Michel was alone in the office, reviewing paperwork, visibly tired. She knocked, asked if she could speak with him privately, and followed him into the small stone room behind the chapel. That is where it began. The conversation that would either give Mossad the confirmation it needed, or end with her exposed, trapped, and alone in a city that does not forgive Israeli operatives. She did not accuse. She did not ask direct questions. She simply expressed concern, in the most careful, pastoral language she could construct, about whether some of the church's activities might be putting the parish at risk. She mentioned that she had noticed certain visitors who seemed uncomfortable around the regular volunteers. She suggested, gently, that perhaps some of the financial arrangements were not as transparent as they should be. And then she said Fadi's name. Father Michel's face changed. Not dramatically, but enough. He paused. He looked at the paperwork in front of him. And then, in a voice that carried just a hint of doubt, he said something that confirmed what Mossad had suspected for over a year. He said that Fadi had connections he did not fully understand, that some of the people Fadi introduced to the church seemed more interested in logistics than charity, that there had been moments, small moments, when he wondered if Fadi's involvement was entirely what it appeared to be. It was not a confession. It was not even an accusation. But it was enough. The woman thanked him. She reassured him that she was probably overthinking things. She suggested they both keep an eye on the situation, but not make any sudden changes. And then she left the room, walked calmly out of the church, and made her way to the first extraction point. 3 hours later, she was in Cyprus. The intelligence was transmitted to Tel Aviv, and Mossad began planning the next phase of the operation. Not an arrest, not a confrontation, but something far more surgical. Mossad did not move immediately. The confirmation from Father Michel was valuable, but acting on it too quickly would expose the source. Instead, the intelligence was used to map the rest of the network. Over the next 6 weeks, Israeli signals intelligence began intercepting communications that confirmed Fadi's role. Financial surveillance tracked money moving from IRGC-linked accounts into the church's charity fund, then out again to shell companies in Turkey and Cyprus. Surveillance teams in Lebanon, working through local assets, confirmed that Fadi was meeting with known Hezbollah logistics officers. But the operation was not about Fadi. It was about the network. And Mossad's analysis revealed something more concerning than a single operative. Fadi was one of at least 7 Hezbollah officers using religious and charitable institutions across Lebanon as logistical cover: churches, mosques, NGOs. All of them operating in mixed or neutral neighborhoods. All of them using the same operational model: small, irregular financial transfers, meetings disguised as charity coordination, and a reliance on the institutional respectability of religious organizations to avoid scrutiny. The decision came down to how to dismantle this without triggering a wider escalation. A direct strike on Fadi would expose the operation and likely lead to retaliation. But doing nothing meant allowing Hezbollah to continue using this model, potentially expanding it. Mossad chose a third option. They burned the network quietly. They leaked intelligence to Lebanese security services through a carefully constructed channel that made it appear as though the information came from internal Lebanese sources, not Israeli intelligence. They fed financial irregularities to investigative journalists in Beirut, pointing them toward the charity accounts without revealing the full scope of the operation. And they used their own assets inside Lebanon to spread rumors within Hezbollah that the network had been compromised by internal leaks, not external penetration. The effect was precise. Within 3 months, Fadi and 2 other operatives were quietly reassigned by Hezbollah's internal security. The church's charity operations were placed under tighter oversight by Lebanese authorities. Several of the financial channels were shut down, and Hezbollah's leadership began to question whether the civilian cover model was as secure as they had believed. Fadi was never arrested, he was never publicly exposed, but his network was dismantled, and the operational model Hezbollah had invested in for years was compromised. The woman who had spent 11 months inside that church never returned to Lebanon. Her cover identity was retired. Her legend was burned. But the intelligence she provided became the foundation for a broader Mossad campaign to identify and disrupt Hezbollah's use of civilian institutions as a covert infrastructure. It was not a headline operation. There were no airstrikes, no assassinations, no dramatic confrontations. But in the quiet, patient world of intelligence work, it was a textbook example of how a single operative, placed carefully and given enough time, can unravel an entire network without firing a shot. Operations like this do not end with the intelligence report. They end with the questions no one wants to answer. The woman who walked into that church knew she was putting civilian lives at risk. Father Michel never knew he was part of an Israeli intelligence operation. The congregation never knew their church had been used as a battlefield. And when the network collapsed, some of those people paid a price they did not understand. Father Michel's parish came under scrutiny from Lebanese authorities. Some volunteers were questioned. Donations dropped as rumors spread about financial irregularities. The church's reputation, built over decades, was damaged by an operation it never consented to. Mossad would argue that the alternative was worse. If Hezbollah had continued using religious institutions as logistical cover, the risk of those sites becoming targets in a future conflict would have been far higher. By exposing the network before it became operationally critical, Mossad arguably protected those institutions from being drawn deeper into the covert war. But that is the logic of intelligence agencies. It is not the logic of the people whose lives become collateral in these operations. Father Michel did not choose to be part of this. The volunteers did not choose to have their trust weaponized, and the congregation did not choose to have their church turned into a node in a shadow war between Israel and Hezbollah. This is the moral ambiguity that defines covert operations. There is no clean outcome. There is only the choice between bad options and worse ones. Mossad saw a threat. It neutralized that threat using the tools available, and in doing so, it turned ordinary people into instruments of intelligence work, whether they knew it or not. The broader question is whether this kind of operation can be justified. If you believe that intelligence agencies have a responsibility to prevent attacks before they happen, then operations like this are not just justified but necessary. The weapons Fadi was helping to move into Lebanon were not theoretical, they were real. And if Mossad had waited for those weapons to be used, the cost would have been measured in lives, not just institutional damage. But if you believe that using civilian spaces as battlegrounds, even covertly, crosses a line, then this operation represents exactly the kind of overreach that makes covert work so dangerous. Because once you accept that churches, schools, hospitals, and charities can be treated as legitimate intelligence targets, you erase the distinction between combatants and civilians. And that distinction is one of the few remaining boundaries in modern conflict. Mossad does not operate in a world where those boundaries are clear. It operates in a world where the enemy uses civilian infrastructure deliberately, where waiting for certainty means waiting too long, and where the cost of inaction is often higher than the cost of acting. But that does not make the moral calculus simple. It just makes it unavoidable. The woman who sat across from Father Michel in that small stone room made a choice. She chose to prioritize the mission over the trust of the people around her. She chose to use their goodwill as cover, and she did it knowing that when the operation ended, those people would be left with the consequences. That is the cost of working in the shadows. Not just the operational risk, not just the threat of exposure or death, but the knowledge that every move you make, every relationship you build, every moment of trust you create is a tool, and tools get used, and sometimes they break. If you were in that room, facing that choice, knowing what was at stake, would you have made the same call? At what point does protecting your country justify turning ordinary lives into weapons? And who gets to decide where that line is? These are not questions with easy answers, but they are the questions that define covert work, and they are the questions that stay with operatives long after the mission ends. If this operation opened your eyes to how real intelligence work operates in the spaces between war and peace, subscribe to Hidden Ops for more true missions from the world of covert operations.